Okay. As usual, everyone please comment and ask on anything. I figured coming into Erev Yom Kippur here, we would talk about the halachas of Yom Kippur. We just had right title, but really ran through everything. Kitzur halachas throughout the whole day. I just want to try to give some of the background to some of the halachas. So as we know, the Torah describes Yom Kippur as a day which, first of all, is similar sanctity to Shabbos. It has all the regular halachas of Shabbos in terms of malacha. But besides for that, it describes it as a day of Inui. The Isser of the day that's unique to Yom Kippur is an Isser of Inui. The Torah says really in a positive command, Tanu es nafshosechem, that you're required to, we translate it as afflict yourself, or basically not do specific pleasurable actions. And we have another pasuk that says anyone who does not ma'ana themselves, anyone who does not afflict themselves. I'm not sure if I'm not sure if I'm comfortable with affliction as a translation, because you're not in English, that seems to come off as like you're actively doing something. It's more of
you're not eating or drinking.
It's passive, yeah. It's a passive.
I don't know of a better adjective.
A passive affliction. So it says in the Torah that if a person does not do that, then they are chayiv karis.
So you're actually depriving yourself of normal pleasures.
Normal pleasures, right? Deprivation is maybe also a good way to describe it. So we know that Chazal understand that this is referring to 5 specific prohibitions. That is the Isser of Achila, which includes eating and drinking, the Isser of Rechita, which includes different types of washing, the Isser of Sicha, which is anointing oneself with ointments, the Isser of Ne'ilas HaSandal, which practically is wearing leather shoes, and the Isser of Tashva Shemitah, marital relations. So each of these 5 things, the Gemara makes a limud for, that they have some connotation of Inui. The word Inui is used by them. The Gemara says it very clearly by Achila. The other ones, the Gemara actually ends up giving other sources. It seems like at the end of the day, the Gemara needed another source of Shabbos Shoson in order to learn out the other Inuyim. But one thing is clear. The Gemara tells us that the only thing, when the Torah says that if you do not deprive yourselves on Yom Kippur, you do not afflict yourself on Yom Kippur, that you're chayiv karis, that is only referring to the Isser of Achila. Eating, which includes drinking as well, only that prohibition is what's included in the statement, if you do not afflict yourself, you become chayiv karis. The question is, the other 4 prohibitions, are they derived? Are those biblical prohibitions? They just don't have a chayiv karis by them? Or are they just rabbinic? Are they just midrabanan? And this can have many different practical applications we'll try to get to. So going through the different cases, let's just mention a bunch of cases and try to see if we could come up with some type of conclusion on this issue. So the Gemara, the Mishnah tells us that a melech, a king, and a kala, which is a woman who just got married, she's within 30 days of getting married, she is allowed, he and her, they are allowed to wash their face. On Yom Kippur, they're allowed to wash their face.
They still can't eat or drink.
They still can't eat or drink. They're allowed to wash their face. And the question is, and we understand that these people have a more, desperate need, that they shouldn't go a day without washing. The Melech is representing the whole nation. He needs to he has to present himself in a certain way. That's his responsibility as a Melech. We understand that a Kala is in a special time, and she needs to present herself in a certain way. But if this is an Isser Deraisa, to not wash oneself on Yom Kippur, if this is a biblical prohibition, then how could a person do such a thing? How could Chazal say that gives such a heter? That's one question. We know that the general rule is that something which is usher to do, something which is a negative commandment, the only heter in general is a sakana, which we have by eating and drinking. The only heter is a sakana. Otherwise, it's an isser kares, and we have a lot of complications on how to determine what a sakana is. But the only factor that we're cheshboning, the only thing that we're taking into account is this a sakana or not? When it comes to washing, we see already that the Mishnah says it's mutter in these situations. Furthermore, it says that a woman who's postpartum is allowed to wear sandals, meaning she's allowed to wear what we call sana, leather shoes. She's allowed to wear leather shoes.
I've heard within 3 days. I mean, if one has baby within 3 days of Kippur, she's not even allowed to fast. It needs to be regular meals.
Very good. So that's because of sakana. That's because there's a concern. She's in a worse situation, and that's because of sakana. But this isn't not a sakana seemingly. In fact, there seems to be a very good proof that it's not a sakana for her to wear shoes, because the Gemara brings another opinion that the Chachamim say it's usher. So it's a machlokes. So if someone's saying it's usher, everyone agrees that anything which is a sakana is allowed to be performed. So it must be that it's not a sakana. And nevertheless, there's an opinion in the Gemara that says that she's allowed to wear leather shoes. If this was to be an isser deraisa wearing leather shoes, then how could that be permitted?
Well, in those times during the Beis Hamikdash, when all leather was not permissible for footwear, what did they use for footwear?
Maybe they didn't.
So the Gemara discusses different types of footwear that is permissible on Yom Kippur. The Gemara describes shoes that are made of wood, probably very uncomfortable. The Gemara describes certain types of very thick sock type of things. The Gemara describes like other types of things.
Slippers or something that are not leather?
Yeah, they didn't have like we have slippers, but they had different alternatives that were really not comparable to what we have today, which is a whole other question. You
actually have to go barefoot.
It could be that it's very possible that people it appears that was much more common, even not going back all the way to the days of the Talmud, but just before they started manufacturing so many different types of shoes.
Before Crocs.
Right, exactly. There was not as much of a desire to wear shoes. It's very different nowadays. But anyway, the question stands: how could she wear shoes if this is a biblical isser? Another case in the Gemara talks about someone who has boils or certain things, a certain skin issue on his head. The Gemara says he's allowed to anoint himself with oil. Doesn't sound like it's talking about a sakana. Doesn't make any mention of a sakana. It sounds like it's just
dry scalp.
Just some boils or some skin ailment, but there's nothing that seems to be a sakana, and the Gemara says it's 100% mutter. No worries.
So if these were really promulgated by the Chachamim, the same Chachamim could create their own limitations at that time.
Exactly. So that's what I'm about to get to. I'll just bring one more example and then bring out this conclusion that you're making based on all we have. One last example, and this is the most common example that all of us use every Yom Kippur, is that the Gemara says that if one's hands are dirty with some type of cement or mud, different things like that, other types of waste, then they're allowed to wash their hands. They're allowed to wash it off. So again, obviously there's no sakana over here. Obviously it's uncomfortable to have dirty hands. But if this is an Isser D'Oraisa, what is the heter to do such a thing? So many Rishonim make the conclusion that Mr. Miller just made, which is that it must be that these are derabanan. There's only one Isser Daraisa of Inui, and that is the Isser of eating and drinking. And the other ones are derabanan. And as Mr. Noah said, Hey Mamru, they said that they created the Isser. So they can say that the Isser only applies in these circumstances and otherwise doesn't.
Now before, let's say they did that. In the years before they did that, were people just creating their own Inuyim on their own?
I mean, before Chazal...
Before these derabbanans were put in place.
The first question is, when did this happen?
Right.
If it's derabbanan. It's quite early.
But we don't know how early.
I'm not aware of any time in any Yom Kippur in history that there was not, that these Yisurim did not apply. I mean, based on the upcoming opinion that we'll see that maintains that it's deraisa, there for sure is not anything very clear that that there was ever such a heter. But
it could even be
it could be even from it could be that. Could be, or from the bezin of the upcoming generation. It doesn't. It wouldn't be a halacha Moshe Sinai, like the way that we use the term halacha Moshe Sinai, and that a pure halacha Moshe Sinai is the deraisa. That's clear from the Talmud in many places that all real halacha Moshe Sinai is deraisa.
I mean, the ones that we don't have a direct source.
Yeah, so there are other. So usually halacha Moshe, if he uses the phrase halacha Moshe Sinai, usually that means it's deraisa, despite the fact that it has no source. That's really the point of the phrase, is that there's a halacha that can be deraisa that has no source. There are things that are extremely early that are derabanan, or is even takanas that Moshe Rabbeinu made, or even the following generation. So you do have such a concept of things that are extremely early that were not a formal Isser Deraisa.
What's Divrei Sofrim? Where does that play? Where does that?
So Divrei Sofrim, according to a basic understanding, in the Talmud, is talking about an Isser Derabanan. In the Rambam, there's a very much longer discussion, much more complicated discussion about what Divrei Sofrim means. It's clear that the Rambam used the phrase Divrei Sofrim for things which are deraisa, but that's just a question of deraisa derabanan, not a different status. There's another thing of Divrei Kabbalah, which has a source in the Navi, that might be what you're referring to, that has also a lot of discussion about that, whether that could be possibly a different level of a derabanan, a higher level of a derabanan, which is treated more stringently in different areas of halacha.
When the Nevi'im would criticize the Jews for following the letter of the law on Yom Kippur, but oppressing each other and doing all the rest, which was bad anyway, didn't see the disconnect. Which examples of Inui were they talking about? I think fasting was one, but was there any other that the Nevi'im spoke of?
I don't know. Good question.
Because I think the Nevi'im will say at times, you guys are fasting, but look at all these terrible things you keep doing anyway. But I don't think they only talked about fasting.
I'm not sure. Anyway, this group of Rishonim, the Balitosis and the Rosh, they conclude that it must be that all these four things are only midirabanan. However, there is a Ran who deals with their question. First, what's pushing the Ran is that the Ran is bothered primarily by a Gemara, where it tells us that where there's a chi of kares. The Gemara tells us that the Isser of Achila and Shtia has an Isser kares, and the other prohibitions do not have an Isser kares. And the Ran is bothered if these other four prohibitions are only midirabanan.
And kares won't even come
Why
up.
does the Talmud need to tell us that this doesn't have kares? It's a derabanan. There's no starting point to have kares. So that implies that really it's an Isser Daraisa, and the Gemara is coming to be Mechadish, just coming to tell us that no, this, even though it's Asr Midaraisa, it doesn't have the severity of kares. So that is the Ran's opinion. Now the question is, how does everyone deal with each other's questions? So the easier is for the first group of Rishonim, what we'll call the Rosh Shita, that all of them are Darabanan. So the Rosh has a simple answer. It's called the concept of Ismachta. We find this many times. We find this in the Gemara. We find the Rishonim using it more. The Ismachta is the concept that you could have the Talmud put a pasuk, show a certain prohibition or mitzvah has a certain source in scripture, and at the same time that it's not a real derivation, it's not a pure derivation, it doesn't actually teach a full-fledged Yisraisa, but it's only a derabanan. Sometimes there's a big discussion what Ismachta is. Is Ismachta just an illusion? The Ritva is very unhappy with that. The Ritva says that it's not just alluding to something, but it's not just a hint to it, but rather the Torah is actually referring to it.
Well, it could be a really heavy hint, but still a hint.
Right. Okay. So that's a discussion. But there's a concept of Ismachta, relatively common, and the Rosh and these Rishonim say that this whole thing is Derabanan. The Psukim that the Gemara brings is just an Ismachta. The question is, how does the Ran deal with all these questions, glaring questions, where there's clearly no issue of sakana, and nevertheless says straight in the Gemara that you're allowed to do these have these particular leniencies in regards to these four prohibitions. So the Ran tells us a very fundamental concept, which is called Masran HaKasav L'Chachamim. So we know that sometimes Chazal, more commonly, Chazal interpret what it says in the Torah and make enactment in addition to what it says in the Torah. Interpreting is using Yud Gimel Midas and other things, using the laws of derivation on how to interpret psukim, having traditions on how to understand words, basically interpreting what the Torah is telling us, which without the words of Chazal would be like a closed book. Another thing which is common is enactments, where the Rabbanan added something to protect against an Isur or to commemorate a particular thing that came after, and they created an enactment in addition to the Torah. Those are the two most common things that we have. Says the Ran, there's a third thing. The expression really comes up in the Talmud itself, but the Ran elaborates on this point that there is something called Masran HaKasav L'Chachamim, which means that the Torah left open the parameters of a particular prohibition and left it to the rabbis not to interpret, not to enact, but to actually define and to actually legislate what the halachas of that particular prohibition should be.
So you have to have a law about this, but you figure out the terms.
Yes. So I'll give you two common examples of this. There's really many more, but two famous examples of this is that one is the Isra of Chol HaMoed. The Isra Malacha on Chol HaMoed is learned out in the Gemara from a brisa using psukim, and many hold that it is many Rishonim hold that it's deraisa, but the Torah never says which malachas you can do and which malachas you cannot do. So the understanding according to these Rishonim that hold that the prohibitions of malacha, the prohibition of malacha on Chol Moed is deraisa, is that it was left to the rabbis to determine which malacha should be asr and which malacha should be mutter. That's the most famous example. Another example is the laws of Onah, the laws of call it like usury, when you rip someone off.
Fraud.
Yeah, fraud. Basically, when you overcharge or undercharge, or are undercharged, so that's the laws of Onah. The Torah says it's asr. It's an Isser Deraisa. But it doesn't say what's considered the amount of overcharging or undercharging which is included in that in the prohibition of ona. And Chazal give us different shiurim for when the Isra of ona applies. Ramban tells us that's Mashna Kazvu Chachamim. That was something that the Torah left open for the Rabbanan to define what the Isra is. Says the Ran.
Who's the one that says it? Who's the one that's saying this?
The Ran.
The Ran. He's the one that is mechadish this thing.
He's mechadish it over here. You have it in a bunch of other places. He's the one that's bringing it over to the Shari Inuyim. And the Ran tells us that the idea over here is also that these four things are derived. But the Torah does not have any clear description of what Inui is, what's called afflicting. And the Gemara has a stronger source that eating and drinking are literal, the more literal definition of Inui. But the other four things are not, and you need another pasuk of in order to include them in an Isser Daraisa at all, and it's undefined. The Torah left it open. Says the Ran, the Torah left it open for the Rabbanan to determine what the halacha should be, to determine what's considered Inui and what's not considered Inui.
Does that mean the Rabbanan could change their minds at some point?
That's a good question. They would need to be, in order to have the question, they would need to be qualified.
Right.
Now, typically, the question that question is usually being dealt with when we're talking about an enactment, and the basic principle is that a bezdin, in order for a bezdin to overturn something that a previous bezdin did, they have to be gadol b'chachma b'minyan. They have to have a certain stature. I have never seen, as far as I remember, a discussion about Mashon HaKasav l'chachamim being overturned. It would be hard for me to imagine that it would be able to be overturned.
So there's some original group of chachamim, and that's that.
Yes.
Is it a specific takana? Like they decided Masar HaKasav l'chachamim, so now we're gonna take up Hashem's offer on defining it, and now we're gonna do it. Like, how does it?
Basically, from when the Torah, meaning Chazal understood that in certain places where the Torah created, let's say, an Isser, it tells us there's a prohibition, but it's just undefined. So sometimes you have that it is defined, just you have to, there's Yud Gimel Midas or something else to determine what the rules are. But in certain places, Chazal understood it was left open. The parameters were left open. Such as over here, the parameters of what Inui are were left open. There was a whole group of Isurim that were referred to that the Torah didn't give us any details about. It didn't even tell us what they are really. And Chazal had the job of creating these set of laws and creating what the Isurim Deraisa are going to be.
They're sleeping in a sukkah like that, where they could, with the details of when and how.
So that is more of a question of interpretation. I think that would be more in the first category, which is that you have a pasuk of that says that you should basically live in the sukkah. You need Chazal to make a drasha of Teshu Kain Taduru and tell you that that's a general principle. That's the way to understand the pasuk. That's the way to interpret the pasuk. And then you need Chazal to tell us what's considered a living action, what's not considered a living action. That you already have a guiding principle from the Torah itself. It's more of a question of interpretation. Over here, you really have no guiding principle.
Well,
This
for example,
concept is when there's no guiding principle.
If it's sprinkling out, not necessarily a super heavy rain. If you wouldn't like that happening inside your house, is that germane to this?
So yes, so that meaning that idea that you'd be allowed to go in from your sukkah, because that's no longer in the guidelines of regular living in the sukkah. that's really just a more typical question of interpretation,
Mm-hmm.
of how to understand what the mitzvah is. But the guidelines, the basic principle, Chazal didn't have to create. They didn't have to create rules. They just had to define what was already existent, using a source that's already there and just defining it for us. These are more unique, where you have something where it has no guiding principle, and Chazal need to create laws.
Now, is there a fundamental difficulty because we're presuming that these kinds of laws had details filled in by Chacham at a certain point in time, and now that's it. They're there. But can anyone point to any set of Chacham and say they're the ones who did it?
Someone probably could, but I can't. I don't know. I don't know how to answer that question. I would assume that it's something that was dealt with at the time of the Mesiras HaTorah, at the time the Torah was given over.
So that gets
I would
close to being
assume
Torah
that-
Shabbat Peh, right?
So yeah, certainly true. Certainly a chiluk of Torah Shabbat Peh. But I do not think that this is something that just sat around undefined for generations and then was dealt with after. I assume it was a part of the Kabbalah Torah. But again, I can't answer that question very definitively.
So aren't they just defining, meaning can't the guiding principle be Inui, and they're just defining what is considered Inui?
I mean, the same way as
Happens
living
to
in a
be
sukkah
that-
is what, and so Inui is what?
Meaning they're defining what's considered Inui. The problem is with that is that really they defined what's considered Inui, eating and drinking. Meaning you can't say that these things are part of the definition of Inui because then they should be chayiv kares. So the Torah says that which is not Inui is chayiv kares. So they're not really in the pure definition of Inui. So they're just a group of prohibitions that was alluded to in the Torah, but doesn't really have any guiding principle.
So then it's more of like they're adding something on. Then it's
Well, the Torah
seems like
alludes to it itself. The Torah
to
gives
these
us
specific-
right. The Torah gives us a source. It seems to be the bottom line source is Gemara darshes out from Shabbos Shabboson to say that these Inuyim are included. But there is a source in the Torah that says that there are other things which are usher on Yom Kippur, even though they're not in the strict definition of Inui. So you can't really use the guiding principle of Inui to create these halachas, because that really only refers to achil v'shtia. Just one last point is that the Ran has a question on himself, which he cannot. He leaves off struggling. He doesn't answer this question. He's the one that holds that this is deraisa, and he's the one that tells us the idea over here is Marital chachamim. And the Ran says, is a Gemara that he can't explain. The Gemara says that in regards to children, you're allowed to, basically freely provide children with any of the things which are generally usher. Besides for shoes, a separate discussion, but you could bathe them normally, feed them normally, etc. So the Ran is bothered that he doesn't understand. Over there, how could you, if this is an Isser D'Oraisa, how could such a thing be mutter? There's no, nothing's going to happen if the child doesn't get a bath.
Well, maybe Inuyim only apply to adults.
So, Katanim are human beings.
Well, yeah, they're not adults.
But they have the same physical, they're weaker, but we're not talking about something which they're going to be even afflicted by. Talking about putting some cream on them, bathing them, giving them the regular bath. I mean, doesn't seem to be so pressing. I don't know, my kids wouldn't complain if I didn't bathe them in a week, but so the Ran is bothered by this question, and he leaves off with a tzarachin. He leaves off with an unanswered question. Beis Yosef comes and he likes the approach of the Ran, and the Ran points out that the Rambam sounds like him. We know the Beis Yosef follows the Rambam very strongly. The Rambam sounds like that all 5 prohibitions are from the Torah, and the Beis Yosef suggests, on behalf of this approach, that extend the same idea. Chazal was Marsana Kazav Chachamim, so Chazal said that we don't see fit that we should answer these things on katanim, that we should answer these things on children. Once they're making legislation, so let them make such a rule. So I was just thinking about what is it that the Ran didn't accept about this answer? Why wasn't the Ran willing to say what the Beis Yosef says? Just say the same idea, just extend to the same thing, say the same thing by katanim. Is there anything different, fundamentally different, between that case and the case of the king washing his face, the case of the postpartum lady wearing shoes, the person who has dirt on them cleaning off the dirt? Is there something different about that heter, those heterim, than this heter? Want to hear the question? Okay.
Well, what's the answer?
I was thinking possibly that, to me, it does seem to be different. In the other examples, it seems to me like the Ran's understanding of Masr Nakasu Chachamim is that they still need to do some. There needs to be some guiding principle to it, meaning that over here, basically, what they said is that these things are not called a pleasurable act. They're just called basics in this situation. In other words, washing normally is considered a pleasurable act. If a person has dirt all over him, that is not considered the same. It's a different type of washing. It's not called washing for pleasure. It's not rechita shel tanug. Right, so Chazal could say only rechita shel tanug, only pleasurable type of rechita is usher. Only that type of washing is usher, and other types of it's qualitatively different. It's more practical to get the dirt off. Right, or like I forgot to mention before, like netilas yadayim in the morning. It's to get the ruach ra off. Right, so it's more practical. It's not for the sake of the pleasure. So it's a different type of thing. The melech, if he wouldn't be washing his face, it would be a dire situation. If the kala would not be washing her face, it would be a dire situation. It's not.
I mean,
it's not
for
the
one
same.
day, you think anyone could really tell?
Okay, so that's a good question in the Matthias, but assuming that it was like that. Whereas when you're talking about the katanim, to just say a blanket thing, by katanim we're not going to apply these isurim, there's nothing that's less of a tainug by them. There's not a particular reason why the type of washing that's being done is no different. The type of anointing with ointments that's being done is no different than the type than everyone else. So it's not really defining it as this is not an action of Inui. It's rather just kind of like saying the whole thing doesn't apply.
Well, is there some kind of blanket exemption for katanim, on most things?
So you have that a lot on their abundance. You have that a lot on their abundance. But the problem is, over here we're talking about a daraisa.
Uh-huh.
Now, just to clarify what that means, it's not a daraisa for a katan himself to do one of these 4 actions. But for a gadol, for an adult to do it for him, is a deraisa.
So if the Katan could wash himself or eat by himself or whatever, it would be less of a problem.
Then the Ran wouldn't have a question. Exactly, the Ran would not be bothered by that. The Ran is only bothered that what we call feeding isurim to ketanim is an isur deraisa. It's derived from the pasuk los achilim, that drasha los achilim, that tells us that there's an isur for an adult to feed or provide really any type of isur to a katan. So we're talking about a deraisa, and that the Ran has trouble with. At the end, he doesn't back away from his shita, and this there are many other Rishonim that take on this shita, and a big discussion in the poskim, which is the ikr. Why does it make such a nafka mina? What should be the nafka mina between these two opinions? We know all the halachas. We have the mishnayos. The kala is this, the melech is this, katanim are this. We have all explicit dinam of what's able to be done. So nafka mina, like all cases, deraisa derabanan, is what about a suffix? Right? We know the general rule is that which is a suffix, deraisa is aser. You have to go l'chumra, a suffix derabanan, you go l'kula. So that is the big nafkamina between the Ran Shita and the Rosh Shita. According to the Ran, if you have a suffix whether something is aser, let's say it's a question whether it's a rechitza shel tanug, it's a question whether it applies in this situation, other types of sveikas, it would seem that according to Ran you'd have to be machmir, and according to the Rosh you'd be able to be mekel, suffix darban l'kula. So that's a big discussion. At the end of the day, the mashmalos of the Shulchan Aruch is that it's deraisa. The Magen Avraham said it's deraisa. That we should be choshish for those poskim, those Rishonim that hold that it's deraisa, and that's the basic bottom line.
So it's still a suffix, but you follow them anyway.
Yeah. So it's. The Magen Avraham, the Shulchan Aruch's wording sounds like it's deraisa. The Magen Avraham just says a simple statement. He says it's deraisa, meaning that he's paskening like the Rambam, like the Ran, that hold that it's deraisa. The Mishnah Berurah takes issue with that because the Mishnah Berurah doesn't like that the Magen Avraham makes it sound like it's not a suffix. The Mishnah Berurah says, at the end of the day, it's still a suffix. It seems like he would possibly still agree that one should be machmir. But he thinks that it should be a suffix. Now, if you consider it a suffix, there are other nafkaminas that if you have another suffix, right? So, if this is also a suffix, if it's like the Magen Avraham, if you just assume that this is vaday asur deraisa, so then if I deal with it as asur deraisa, if I have a different case where I have a suffix, what to do or not? Then according to Magen Avraham, you'll have to be machmir. Possibly, if you would consider it still a suffix, whether it's deraisa, and you would add another suffix into the equation, that could possibly make it darbanan. So, depending on the case, basically, if you deal with it as a vaday asur deraisa or as a suffix asur deraisa, you can have nafka minas.
Okay.
Okay.